Thank you very much for the nice discussion. I now welcome to the floor Fabrizio Gallai
Hello,
on
good
relevance as
afternoon.
a good afternoon, who will present relevance as a shared model for asylum interpreter training.
Let's see if I manage to share my screen first. Can you all see it? I hope so.
Yes.
Yes.
Lovely. So, hello everyone. Thank you, Jill. Thanks to the organizers. And as you said, I'm going to be talking about asylum settings where power relations, as Maria was talking about, are very much present and felt by all participants. Very quick overview of my talk, and a brief introduction, a brief overview of the notion of quality and fidelity in interpreting. And then let's move on to the data set and data set analysis. And I'm going to finish off with a couple of conclusions. So for those of you who are not familiar with the asylum settings, obviously it's a setting where interpreters are very much needed. The interpreter is seen as a reassuring individual, representing a link to their language, culture, and home. And the asylum applicants are rarely able to produce written evidence, and therefore their oral testimonies are the only foundation for the official's decision. So that's where you know the quality of the interpreter's work and translation comes in, and it's so relevant and important. So basic tenets in codes of conduct in my world in dialogue interpreting are obviously competence, confidentiality, and neutrality and impartiality. Big thing. There's a distinction there, as Brunk says. Impartiality is more to do with the interpreter's social position and function, whereas neutrality is to do with the discursive construction of realities in a specific act of communication. So it's enshrined in many, many codes of conduct. And the question obviously is, are these kept in a real scenario? Well, asylum settings are very much critical in terms of what we see. Training and practice vary according to the country. They vary in quality, they vary in consistency, and there's loads of examples of interpreters' omissions, additions, distortions. So there's a mismatch between what the codes of conduct tell us to do and what the professional practice in this setting is. So, and this is a common theme in loads of empirical studies on asylum interpreting and legal interpreting in general. So, in the case of my country, Italy, unfortunately, this is also coupled with a lack of recognition of the profession. It's not adequately remunerated. I know it happens in a lot of Southern European countries. It tends to be carried out by people with a strong sense of social welfare, but obviously it should be more on the professional side of things. And when no training is available, interpreters are sometimes refugees themselves. This obviously brings up a lot of issues, especially in terms of power relations. And interpreters for major languages may instead have a host nation background. So they may come from Italy, in my case, and they have no significant links to the applicant's native countries. So culturally and linguistically, this is quite challenging most of the time. This is part of a huge follow-up 2-year project on asylum interpreting, which started a couple of months ago. So this is very much work in progress. It involves loads of scholars from Italian universities, 1 lawyer and 2 external partners. And it will be featured in an article that's going to be published very soon, amongst other scholars in the field, including Agnieszka, who's here, and Robin, on a volume called Applications of Relevance Theory to Translation and Interpreting. So please keep your ear to the ground and your eyes open for the publication. Now, so quality and fidelity, we said, are key to loads of codes of conduct. Well, in the past 40 years, obviously, loads of researchers have harnessed the potential of relevance theory, which has been providing an explanation and training tools for exploring interpreting processes. And it's all based on Gutt's work, Gutt's model, which dates back to the 1990s, which sees translation as a case of interlingual speech. So thanks to meta-representation, translators and interpreters can achieve optimal relevance, resemblance by drawing on cognitive environments of both source text writer and target text audience. Also, some of you know, Gutt talks about COURT, which is a competence-oriented research on translation that seeks to understand translation through understanding the communicative competence that makes it possible. So there's a focus on training and training skills as well as the more theoretical notion of translation as an interlingual case of interlingual speech. In interpreting, we have Robin Sutton, who has, let's say, started talking about simultaneous interpreting through the lens of relevance theory in 1998. And Sutton and Dorrant in 2016 say that the interpreter's goal is to make accessible to the audience the cognitive effects intended by the speaker as she understands them at reasonable processing costs and risk, using whatever communicative devices available in the output language. So this is the definition of the goal of interpreters. Oh. So quality in particular is defined as fidelity plus relevance. So relevance here depends on the speaker's expressive ability, the listener's comprehension, their accessible contexts, and their motivation to communicate. Okay, so when they translate, interpreters must anticipate differences between their own and the target language addressee's cognitive environment. In interpreting, I have particularly looked at some pragmatic clues called discourse markers. As you all know, they're seen as procedural elements that guide co-processing of propositions and the assumptions contained in them. So we, me and Diane Blakemore, have we have analyzed 2 cases of addition of discourse markers in legal interpreting, the non-speaker oriented additions and the speaker oriented additions. Now, as I was saying, this is a huge project. It involves 3 different prefectures where hearings are held here in this country. We've been looking at 9 hearings, especially featuring Nigerian Standard English and Nigerian Pidgin English. So we have 5 interpreters, 4 caseworkers, and we have had semi-structured interviews with the officers and interpreters as well, just to gather more data. For those of you who are not familiar with hearings and interviews in legal interpreting in general, they are split up into 5 major phases. I'm not going to go into detail, but there's a pre-phase, there's phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's an after an interview phase where interpreters are called upon to cite, translate the reports. So it's a very structured and let's say directed way of communicating with questions that are open-ended or close-ended according to the phase that they're put out. Methodologically speaking, we go into the field. Obviously, we go to the prefectures where hearings take place, and we have obviously done an ethnographic study based on a combination of observation, interviews, and documents. The approach is relevance theoretic and discourse centered, so it's qualitative on one side and interdisciplinary as well, mixing up relevance theory with Fadensha's categories taken from Goffman, so interactional linguistics, social linguistics, and interviewing techniques. Now, talking about the data, I'm going to give you 3 examples. I've got about 10 minutes. I'm looking at the clock, I swear, and 10 minutes. And I want to introduce you to 3 examples taken from the corpus. The first one is to do with the use of the first or third person. I'm sure, you know, we said that quality in interpreting is measured by the similarity between the cognitive effects triggered by the regional and those triggered by the interpretation, right? So when it comes to interpreting quality, we say that it hinges on the hearer's inferential capacity, right? So, for example, here in interpreter 4, in utterance 2 and 14, she uses the, she renders the caseworker's speech addressed to the applicant in the third person. Yeah, so the caseworker would say, in which language shall we hold this interview? And in utterance 2, as you see, the interpreter says, he says, which language do we speak, right? So everything is, it's taken from the first person to the third person. Now, this shift from first person to third person is problematic because obviously the first person pronoun would put the participants in the interaction in direct contact. You're creating indirect communication here. You know, in utterances 2 and 14, it's assumed that the hearers are able to work out what is wrong referent. However, this may lead to misunderstanding, and it actually does. If you, you know, when the interpreter switches from third to first person in utterance 9, there's a bit of a misunderstanding in utterance 10. The applicant says, what? I mean, you've been using the third person so far, and now you're using the first person. So unfortunately, we can't just assume that the participants will be able to work out what's wrong in the referent. Now, when it comes to translating implicatures, I've taken this passage from interview 6, phase 2, so the second phase where there's open questions about the story. It's taken from a passage where the asylum seeker is telling how she fell victim of human trafficking for sexual exploitation. She's a Nigerian woman who fell victim of human trafficking. So before the asylum seeker's commencement of her journey to Italy, she recounts how her madam, who's the woman whose job is to recruit prostitutes, wants to take her to the shrine of a juju. Now, in Nigerian English, a juju is a sort of doctor, let's say, who performs a juju rite. And the purpose of this ritual is to control, it's a control mechanism to keep the victims bound and subservient to the madam. Aside from a number of serious omissions in her rendition and questionable stylistic choices, what interests me here is the utterance 16. Okay, so they've been talking about the juju man. The applicant in utterance 15 says, so what was their argument that she presented was for the juju man? And the interpreter translates, told her everything. It was our agreement. I don't know what they did, but she gave everything to the doctor, the man. So the interpreter, when she goes into Italian, she doesn't translate juju man, but as simply as doctor. The caseworker doesn't understand, and he says, I don't know how she called him a doctor. The interpreter, utterance 18, decides to give the proper name, juju man. And so the interpreter in utterance 18 decides not to explain the implicatures for the juju man. Okay, so first she translates it as doctor and then decides to keep juju man without explaining the implicatures. Now, indirect communication through implied meaning can occur in the form of implicatures, so whose meaning must be worked out through an analysis of the speaker's meaning in a given context. So the source text speaker, such as the applicant here in utterance 15, may use the addressee's ability to work out the implied meaning in order, for example, to relieve themselves from having to express the intended meaning explicitly themselves. So interpreters thus have three options. First of all, they could reduce implicatures as they are in the source text, they could explicate them, or they could reproduce implicatures with a side commentary added to explicate the implied meaning, which is what she should have done here in utterance 16. Okay, so she should have added a side comment. Now, this choice obviously also depends on the interpreter's knowledge about whether the intended recipients are as capable of, that is, used to inferring unexpressed meanings in communication. So in other words, we don't know what the caseworker's cross-cultural pragmatic skills are. We can't just assume that the caseworker knows what the juju man is. And so interpreters should take the cross-cultural pragmatic skills in check. They are a prerequisite for deciding to what extent the implied meaning can be inferred in different contexts. So last example comes from interview 1, phase 2, same phase, open questions to do with the story. I've got 3 different examples that are very much alike. Here, interpreter in utterance 2. So the applicant says, after 2 weeks, I look for my mum to give her money, and I find out that my brother has been arrested by these people. The interpreter translates into Italian, and she goes, so after 2 weeks, I went to look for my mum to hand out some money, okay? And there I found out that my brother has already been arrested by these people. Now, she adds so, discourse marker so, procedural element so, theoretically, to guide the hearer to the intended interpretation, even though discourse markers do not contribute to the proposition expressed by the utterance that contains them. Same thing here. Why arrest his brother if he was not involved in that crime? The interpreter says, since they took my brother, so I have to go out to get my brother released. This so wasn't there when the applicant spoke. Same thing here. The applicant in utterance 3 says, they came looking for me and they arrested my brother. So there was nothing. He just told me that policemen came looking for me and arrested my brother. They were all added by the interpreter. Again, we would say that these additions are actually speaker-oriented, okay? So while the interpreter's rendition communicates a guarantee that any effort expanded by the hearer in processing it will be justified by relevant cognitive effects, the reward for this effort is a meta-representation of the interlocutor's thoughts, rather than a representation of what the interpreter thinks about the asylum seeker's thoughts. In other words, the interpreter is ensuring that the only voice we hear is that of the applicant, thus creating the illusion of the applicant acting out her mental state in direct relationship with the caseworker. So it's a good addition. So quickly to wrap up, so my analysis shows that there's a potential for relevance theory framework to conceptualize quality and fidelity, as obviously Robin Seton also acknowledged. Quality is not to be equated with similarity, linking up to what Ryoko said this morning, but it's measured by the equivalence between the cognitive effects triggered by the original text and those triggered by the interpreter's rendition. Cross-cultural pragmatic skills are key to all this. And so asylum interpreters intervene in a lot of different ways, mostly negative, unfortunately. They omit, they add, they alter the original text. Yet there's a number of these alterations can lead to changes in utterance, meaning positively, like the discourse markers addition that we saw. So practice is variable with respect to the positive and negative impact on the interview phases. And the path ahead, I would say, is more and more professionalization and more high quality standards. We need to pay attention to education. We need to recruit better recruitment policies. We need to regulate the profession where appropriate. We need to be aware of professional consciousness and solidarity, and we need to include all players. This is the main task of our project at the moment. We are calling upon all sorts of interpreter users to cooperate with us and try and create a better and safer place for interpreters. These are some of the selected references, and I thank you for your attention. Last but not least, just a quick note. It's fresh. Hopefully, we'll be able to organize a conference in July next year in Brazil. It's RT2, and it will be the note will be sent out very soon. But again, for this, keep your ears to the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation.
Thank
we
you.
now have 8 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to raise their hand.
Well, I think
Hi, Agnieszka.
Yes, actually, I wanted to raise my hand. I don't know if I did effectively. Can I ask a question?
Yes, it worked.
Okay,
Yes,
sorry. Yeah, so, well, thank you very much, Fabrizio. That's always not just hugely interesting, but also it has really big social implications. And I sort of I wanted to share with you that I came across a similar line of research, which is about interpreters in medical context, right? So when non-English speaking patients are admitted by doctors in the UK, that was about psychiatrists, so it was about mental health issues. So as far as I know, the result of that research, they very much converge with your findings, that actually that well, more often than not, the interpreters' interventions are not well, may affect the patient in that case rather negatively, right? So certain omissions, like, you know, so there are those different pressing forces, because the interpreter may think that the time is the most important factor, so they just shorten what the doctor says or what the patient says, but the consequences, unfortunately, are that somehow the patient feels they are not treated with due respect or similar. But I just wanted to express my real, you know, appreciation of the implications your research has. And
thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you. Well, you know, that we have so many examples of omissions, additions, alterations. I've talked about a positive case of discourse markers being added, but the situation is quite dire. So not just, as you're saying, in legal settings, but across the board in dialogue interpreting. So hopefully, you know, with my project and other projects, especially in Europe, we'll be able to change situations. When it comes to codes of ethics and conduct in particular, we try and push the cross-cultural pragmatic skills agenda further, you know, to let them understand that we, you know, pragmatics is part and parcel of communication. Yes.
Hello? Hello?
Hi, Robin.
Yes.
Oh, hi. I think I've just discovered how to put my hand up, metaphorically. I pressed audio. Can I ask, say something? Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Yes, we
can
can
hear
hear
you.
you.
Sorry, Robin.
Okay. No, I just wanted to cheer from the sidelines because I can see, another example of the difficulties we face trying to research this extremely difficult, messy, and also very sensitive and important area. I get the impression that, unfortunately, you already said the situation was dire, that the additions, in the data, there are some additions or omissions that you say are good. It turns out they're good, but one gets the impression it's just really a piece of luck that at that moment, that the person hasn't really been trained in any way. But at the same time, you could say, to look on the bright side, that if they make this kind of non-equivalence based interpretation, it means that somehow there's something fundamental to our sense of communication that leads an untrained person to go to the meaning that she thinks, the speaker means, which is the good side, I suppose. But considering the institutional background and everything that you mentioned, I can see you've got a very difficult path ahead. So, toi, 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 as they say in Germany. Good luck.
I couldn't agree more, Robin. I think, you know what? It's not just to do with dialogue interpreters. I still, at the moment, I'm leading the conference interpreting program here in Milan. And to be fair, my colleagues are not very much into pragmatics in general. And, when they teach conference interpreting, it's all about word for word equivalence. We're still very much, it's still, I'm not saying like 40 years ago, but it's not always the interpreter's fault. Sometimes I think the trainers need to be trained as well, in particularly in cross-cultural pragmatic skills awareness. So yeah,
absolutely. And I hate to say this. This is perhaps more frank than is appropriate on this channel, but one so much wants to, if you believe in this, the relevance theory and its relevance to one's own domain, you so much want to use it to train and everything. But sometimes this leap to be made from the theory, because to develop such a sophisticated theory, of course, in some ways you get the impression it's become quite jargon heavy, and a lot of it seems quite abstract. And people that are otherwise very intelligent and tuned to communication sometimes start glazing over very soon when I start trying to explain it to them. So there's some work to be done in this bridge from theory to pedagogy, which I think everybody could think about.
Yeah.
Although
and it doesn't help that linguistics courses are being cut as well, so they don't have the basis of general linguistics. How can you move on to do some applied pragmatics as well?
Yeah, everything's been cut and stuff. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Robin.
Well,
yes,
thanks.
Rico?
Thanks again for your speech.
Sorry. So, Rico, you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me there?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Fabrizio. It was really interesting. And might have missed some parts, but I think your talk really highlighted the importance of interpreter training, and especially in this current social climate as well. But what I'm noticing here is that the reliance or dependence out of necessity on the machine translation, including really basic Google Translate. I know some medical facilities in Japan having to use Google Translate, even midwife in the delivery room using Google Translate with patient with no Japanese, giving birth to a child. And that is where we need interpreter, I suppose. But I think being able to have interpreter is to some extent luxury. Can't say luxury is necessary, but not always possible. So I think other theoretical work we have to do, or we should be aiming to develop, is a contribution to more machine translation or more technology. But when I speak to machine translation scholars, they often say relevance theory cannot be used because we can't put relevance into numbers.
Right. So
yeah,
any
idea on that?
I've got an answer to that, actually. First of all, in this volume that I'm showing you, there's Robin Setton's article, which is the start of, it sparks a discussion on this. And I actually am following a side project, which is, unlike this, it's the very start of the project. And I've been looking at, because machine interpreting works in cascade systems. So we have, well, there's two ways, but this one is the most popular. So you have the translation, that's the transcription, and you have the written translation of the transcription. Then you have a machine that spells out the written translation, right? So it's a cascade model. And I'm looking at the first two phases of this cascade model at the moment through three softwares: Google software, a Microsoft software called Azure, and Whisper. And I'm applying a Tim Wharton's theory on nonverbal communication, particular on prosody. I'm looking at prosodic elements, suprasegmental elements of speech, and it works really well. And I showed that, that all these suprasegmental elements are not taken into consideration when they do the transcription. So you're losing a chunk of the pragmatic meaning from the original. That's actually, linguistically significant, like semantically significant. So I hope, aside from Robin's article from the volume, this side project will spark a debate as well. So there's work that's being done. Watch the space.
Sounds like we're saying this. Sounds like we're saying the same thing. I didn't know you were working on something like that.
I've started from your article. I've started doing, looking at Google and Microsoft and Whisper.
I didn't think anyone would bring up AI, but it adds to the burdens. It's an uphill struggle because people think this problem is solved, because translation's been looked at as in a problem-solving prism, completely forgetting about the actually very human interactions and the pleasure of also doing translation and everything. All this doesn't exist in this these descendants of computer linguistics, but that's a whole story anyway. I've got talks on it, as you know. So thanks.